Toyota's Land Cruiser has a legendary reputation for reliability and ruggedness, going back to the earliest FJ25s that came to the US shores. Now, those models quickly evolved into the FJ40 that people are mostly familiar with, and the 40 blossomed to include the 45 series, which included wagon body styles. Later still, we got the FJ55, the Iron Pig, which was a dedicated station wagon body style. That later evolved into the FJ60 and 62 of the early 80s, and that then evolved into this, the FJ80 series that we got in the US for 1991. Now the 80 series might have led some people to believe Land Cruiser had gone soft. The rounded edges and the more modern styling could have made you think this was more of a mall cruiser. But don't be fooled, these are just as rugged as their predecessors, and a lot of people think the 80 series is the sweet spot of Land Cruisers. Today we're going to take a deep dive in the 80 series, see what makes it great, also look into some things that are kind of troubling about these models, and just give you some things to look at if you're shopping for an 80 series of your own. By the 90s, the SUV craze was really taking off in the US. And of course, Toyota was off to a great head start. The FJ80 that debuted for 1991 looked the part of a 90s SUV, but of course, its intent ran much deeper than that. One of the little cues that these trucks had that earlier trucks did not were these sliding glass windows. Now, these have been available on Land Cruisers in other countries, but never in the US, and it was a welcome addition. Another thing on these cruisers are these wheel flares. They look like they mean business, but the early models have these small 15-inch wheels and tires. Later, Toyota would go to a 16-inch wheel with a fatter tire. That was part of their move to take the Land Cruiser up market, move it a little closer to Land Rover territory. As they did that, they would add other luxurious trappings, mostly inside, but this 91 kind of shows what the early trucks were like. It's very Spartan on the inside. Now, if you've ever been in any Toyota car or truck from the late 80s or early 90s, everything in here probably seems familiar to you. These seats look like they're out of a Corolla, that instrument cluster looks like it came from a Camry, and just all the switches and everything are very Toyota of the period, which means basic, but there's nothing wrong with that, and cruiser fans tend to like that stuff. Now, as we mentioned, as the 80 series wore on, Toyota was making them nicer, more luxurious, but this 91 has all the early stuff in it. And we kind of like it that way. Now, one problem is that parts not so available for these. The seats, though, are in great shape, and that's not uncommon. The dashboard on ours has one crack in it, and that's actually pretty good because most of these are cracked a lot. And the problem there is this whole dash frame is one piece. It's not a separate pad. And you can't get a new dash frame or pad, and nobody reproduces it. There are covers available for them to make them look a little better. Things like door panels and stuff like that, you can't really buy new, but people tend to look for good used stuff on the market. We're fortunate that our truck is in pretty good shape, and that kind of brings us to a point that's going to come up a lot here. We're going to tell you to find the best truck you can when you're shopping for a Land Cruiser for a variety of reasons, and you'll hear that from other people too. This is a good example. If you want one of these, keep looking. If you don't find the right one right away. Our truck has over 200,000 miles on it, and that doesn't bother us at all, but the fact that the body and the interior are in really nice shape is pretty important. Dash controls in the 80 series are pretty simple. They're, again, very similar to what you'd find in a Toyota car of the time. There are some kind of cool things there. There's buttons to control the power antenna, and Land Cruiser people who like 80 series are kind of fascinated by that. It actually works on this truck. Also, this truck has its original radio, which is kind of crazy, with tape deck, and it still works. Air conditioning controls, again, they look just like what you'd see in a Camry or a Corolla from the time. The air conditioning on this truck would have R12 in it. These systems were pretty robust. If it doesn't work, you're probably going to need to do a 134 conversion, but that shouldn't be that big of a deal. We talked about how the seats look kind of like Corolla seats. They wear like iron. I think these are probably the original seat covers, and again, they've lasted all this time and for nearly 200,000 miles. These seats are not comfortable though. Junior took a long road trip in this thing and it was like a torture device by the time he got to his destination. If you're planning on road tripping one of these a lot, you're probably going to want to upgrade the front seats. These trucks do have carpeting, which makes them seem a little more like an SUV and less like an off-roader. But like the seat covers, it's really tough stuff. And the carpeting is probably one of those things that would not be hard to replace if you needed to. In terms of interior space, the 80 series has about 80 cubic feet of cargo capacity when the second row is folded down. That's the regular back seat. Now the 80 series does have jump seats in the cargo area. They fold down from the sides. When you put the back seat, the second row, up for passengers, you've got about 40 cubic feet left in the normal cargo area with the jump seats folded up. The jump seats are a nice feature on these, and the 2025 Land Cruiser has about the same interior space in the back. It trades a little bit of rear cargo volume for back seat area. However, the 2025 Land Cruiser does not have a third row, which some people are a little irritated about. But beyond that, the 80 series and the rebirth of the Land Cruiser have about the same interior volume. Land Cruisers in the 80 series in the US are mostly going to have power windows, and like a lot of Toyota stuff, they probably still work. One complaint, however, is that they tend to go slow. What you can do is take them apart and lubricate them, because that's probably the #1 thing that slows them down. Clean out the window felt seals around the glass, that will help too. You can get aftermarket replacement regulators, but the general consensus is they're not as good as Toyota. No surprise there. So your best bet is to try to get what you've got to work better, or find good used parts to replace them. Now you'll notice this truck has a shifter for the transfer case. All of these early 80 series trucks also have a button on the dash to lock the transfer case. Later on, locking axles became an option, and all the trucks of the 80 series in the US are automatic transmission. You could get a manual in other countries. Also, all the trucks in the US had 6-cylinder engines. No diesels were optional in the US. Our early 80 series truck has the 3FE engine. This is the Toyota 3FE inline 6-cylinder engine. It's a 4-liter. It's an overhead valve design, which means it has push rods and rocker arms. And it's based heavily on the architecture of the old Chevy stove-bolt engine. This is what Land Cruisers used going way back, and it's known for its durability. It's anvil-like. Unfortunately, it's also known for not having a lot of power. This EFI version is rated at 155 horsepower, and it doesn't move these trucks very well. But they do last a long time, and they don't give a lot of trouble. This one, in accordance with American smog laws, has an air pump and an EGR valve and a lot of vacuum lines, and that's probably where your trouble is going to be if you have a problem. We had vacuum leaks on this one that Junior took care of. It actually needed an intake manifold gasket. There's also a wiring harness there that's wrapped in orange tape that burned through on the EGR tube, and evidently that's a somewhat common issue. Another thing to watch out for in these, from what we're learning, is the heater hoses. There's a bunch of them. Some of them are hard to get to back behind the engine on the firewall, and that means people tended not to replace them, and then they can let go at inopportune times. All of that said, the 3FE is a very solid engine. Now, in 1993, Toyota went to the 1FZ engine. That was a 4.5-liter inline 6, and it had dual overhead cams. The 1FZ, again, Toyota reliability. They don't have a lot of trouble. It's mostly oil leaks and maybe the head gasket issue. They have a timing chain, so there's no belt to worry about. Under the hood, in general, you're not going to have a lot of trouble with a Land Cruiser. All right, we've got our 91 Cruiser up in the air. We're going to take a walk through and look at some areas that you should be aware of. We're going to start up here in the front with these Burfield joints. Now, you might not have heard that term before. These have a closed knuckle. There's nothing too unusual about that, but there are not universal joints inside of those knuckles. Instead, it is a Burfield joint. That's a kind of constant velocity joint. And they're pretty robust. They're not a problem unto themselves. The thing that happens on these trucks is the axle lube, the fluid that is in the differential, is kept separate from the grease that is in those CV joints, the Burfield joints. There's a seal at the end of the axle tubes that keeps them separate. However, over time, they can intermingle, and then you will have a problem. One of the things that causes that is that the vent for the axle can become clogged. That's pretty common on these. If it stays that way, pressure builds up, it blows the fluid from the diff out through the seal into the grease for the burr field. So the way you know is there's a little fill plug on the burr field area, and if you take that out and there's kind of liquidy goo in there, the two have intermingled and you might have a problem. When you're driving the truck, if you cut the wheels really sharply and apply some power and hear a clicking sound, the burr fields may need to be replaced. So with the burr field joints, if they do have to be replaced, you should know they're kind of expensive, about 650 bucks each, and the job is kind of large. Now, if you look under one of these trucks and you see the ball where the knuckle pivots and you see some grease and wetness, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem. If it's oozing, then there may be a problem. They do tend to push some grease out of those wipers. Just make sure it's not wet and drippy and pull that plug and see what's inside. The early 80 series Land Cruisers have front disc brakes and rear drum brakes. Then in 1993, all 80 series got four-wheel disc brakes. Now, before we go any further here, I'm going to point out the most obvious thing. If you're searching for a Land Cruiser, rust is the enemy. That's true of any early Japanese car. Land Cruisers are certainly no exception. These things rusted badly. The frames tended to hold up, the sheet metal really not so much. This truck came from Arizona, so you're going to see a lot of clean sheet metal under here, but if you get underneath one of these things and see lots of corrosion and bolts that are fused together, but the body looks okay, chances are the body's been fixed. So you want to poke around a little, make sure that you're not looking at something that somebody's really patched up. So the frame here under the middle of the truck, as you can see, is really clean. That's unfortunately kind of unusual with Land Cruisers of this vintage, but it's what you want to look for. Surface rust isn't a big problem, obviously. It's rot that you want to watch out for. If you see a lot of rot and corrosion, rot in the floor pans, heavy corrosion on fasteners and the drive shaft and the axles, you want to look at the body extra close, because if it doesn't show rot, it's probably been covered up. Now, if you see wetness under here, and we see some on this truck, that's not necessarily a cause for concern. These things are notorious for kind of oozing fluids over time. If they're puddling on the ground, then obviously you need to look at a seal and find out where that's coming from. But general wetness, they're just kind of like old trucks in that regard. Now, this is our early model with the 3FE engine, and it's backed by the A440F automatic transmission. After this came the A442F, and then I think the A343F. They're all 4-speed automatics, and they're all pretty durable. They're all Aisin Toyota transmissions. There's not really a lot to worry about there. If it functions well when you're driving it, chances are it's in good shape. A typical fluid check on the stick will probably tell you most of what you need. Transfer case on this one, as we said earlier, has that locking center diff. That feature went away later, and a viscous coupling came in. Some more serious off-roaders like to get rid of the viscous coupling or use a transfer case that doesn't have one, but for street-driven and light off-roading, nothing to worry about there, and the transfer cases are also pretty robust on these. The axles, as we said earlier, they're solid front and rear. That's one of the great things about the Land Cruiser. But what you're seeing under here is coil springs at all four corners, and that's an 80s series advantage. A lot of off-roaders like that. The articulation with the coil springs is there's a lot of potential there for improving these things if you do want to go off-road. Shock absorbers are fairly straightforward. The ones on our truck look like they're original and they're all leaking, but not a big deal there. Out back, the axle is fairly heavy duty. All of these seem to have 410 gears. It's a high pinion axle in the front, which a lot of off-roaders like for clearance, but we've been warned that if you're going off-road and you get yourself a little stuck and you have to go in reverse to get unstuck, be nice to it, because heavy throttle in adverse conditions with the transmission in reverse can break that front end probably a little more easily than it should. The rear is not a high pinion. That's a pretty durable piece. Again, the exhaust systems on these are a little crazy. If you live somewhere where smog is a concern, you want to make sure all the correct pieces are there, because they're hard to find now. There's two catalytic converters on that side, a pipe that comes up and over the transfer case. Catback is no problem, but the emissions part of the exhaust system can be. So our early 80 series has what's called a semi-floating rear axle. That's where the axle shaft and the axle flange are one piece, and there's axle retention with a C-clip inside the differential. In 1993, Toyota went to a full floating axle design where the axle shaft and the flange are separate, and there's a separate hub for the wheel. That makes a stronger design. Enthusiasts prefer that type of axle, and as an added bonus, optional on those axles was an E-locker or electric locker. You could hit a switch on the dash and lock both the front and rear differentials. Now, those are hard to find. You can retrofit them, but the aftermarket enthusiasts say that the ARB air locker is a great alternative, and those are readily available. If you're going to upgrade to a taller wheel tire package and you're going to do some off-roading, you're probably going to want to change that to something a little steeper, like 430s or something in the 450 range. Another thing to be aware of is that the aftermarket supports these transfer cases, and there are other gear sets available for those as well. So our early 80 series has these 15-inch wheels that came from the factory. They're usually referred to as SR5 wheels because a lot of Toyota pickups with the SR5 package came with them. Later on, Toyota went to a 16-inch wheel and used a 275/70 tire. That was really a lot beefier and made the truck look a lot more muscular. The tires we have on our truck are not only small, but they're not even an off-road tire. These are really like SUV tires. If you want to do any off-roading, you're probably going to want to go to a bigger wheel and, of course, a more appropriate tire. So the Land Cruiser out on the road is something that definitely feels different than a modern vehicle. You can live with this thing, but it's underpowered. That's the first thing you're going to notice. And this is the early model in '91, so it has a smaller engine with 155 horsepower. You're going to know when you hit a hill or you go to pass somebody that you don't have a lot of power. The 4-speed automatic transmission wants to shift up quickly and it doesn't want to come back down, so you kind of have to put your foot all the way down to get it to kick down. I find myself manually downshifting carefully when I hit a hill or I need to go around somebody because the transmission doesn't come down as early as it should. The motor is fine, it's smooth, it just doesn't have a lot of power. These days every car, even the smallest economy car, seems to have adequate power. Back in the 80s everything was underpowered just about, so this didn't feel so out of place. The steering on this is power, but it is pretty heavy. The assist is low and the steering ratio is pretty wide, so you have to turn the wheel a lot to get a reaction. Not so unusual for an old truck, but definitely not like a modern vehicle. People are starting to realize that these are the ones that you can still get at reasonable cost, and now that people are starting to trick these out a little with bigger wheels and tires and push bars and stuff, they get cool looking really quick. Our early model has the smaller 15-inch wheels and the tires are pretty small for a vehicle this size, and they just ride along. They don't tram, they don't really do anything harsh. We're probably going to put bigger wheels and tires on this, nothing huge, but something a little bit bigger, 17s I think, and we'll see how it is then. We wanted to experiment with putting a larger set of wheels and tires on our early 80s series because that's a really popular thing to do. So we ordered up a set of these TRD wheels to keep it all Toyota. These are 17s and they're a more modern design. And then we wrapped them with these Mickey Thompson Baja Boss tires. These are 285/70/17. That works out to be about 34-inch overall diameter. These are an on-road, off-road tire. They're not supposed to make a lot of noise. We'll find that out later. They're also supposed to fit the body of our Land Cruiser without any lifting or any other modifications. We'll see what happens when we put it down on the ground. Now, we talked earlier about the different axles that were used on Land Cruisers. This early one with the semi-float axles as drum brakes is easy to get wheels on. If you have a later cruiser that has the full floating axle and rear disc brakes, just make sure the wheels you're ordering are going to fit over those components. All right, we're on the road with the 17-inch wheel and tire package on the truck. It looks a whole lot cooler, but as you know, that often means you're trading off a lot. These tires are a lot quieter than I was expecting. I know that we were told there wasn't going to be a lot of road noise, but they look pretty aggressive. It rides along all right, but as predicted, the taller tires are making this thing even slower than it was before. So if you were going to do this like we just did, you're probably going to want to have the axle ratios changed. or put a different engine in it, which keeps coming up around the shop. Land Cruisers were never cheap. They weren't cheap when they were new, and they didn't really get that much cheaper when they got older. When they did get older, if the price did go down a lot, it usually meant that that was a truck that was whooped pretty good and maybe one you didn't want. Today, especially as vintage SUVs are on the rise and have been for some time, Land Cruiser love is strong. And so if you're shopping for an 80 series, you're going to have to spend not outrageous money, but you're not going to find one for $5,000 that is worth having, most likely. And you can check Hemmings to see what the latest values are. I wouldn't expect to see these come down anytime soon, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is not necessarily a bad place to park your money for a while. These are solid trucks. If you take care of one, chances are real good that it's not going to be worth any less than you paid for it. Land Cruisers are cool. You can't go wrong with a Toyota. So if you can get a good deal on one of these, you should probably jump on it.